there is some proportion of dementias that we just don't understand enough about yet to know whether we can meaningfully move the needle on that. Right now, it's estimated that 45 to 70-ish% of dementias are preventable, largely by addressing.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce this fantastic show with Dr. Tommy Wood, the author of his new book, The Stimulated Mind. Future-proof your brain from dementia and stay sharp at any age. Tommy is one of the world leaders in alternative health, ancestral health. He's been doing great work for over a decade. One of my favorite podcast guests ever. We did 2 fantastic shows in person way back in 2019 when I visited him up in Washington State and got to experience his amazing 2 pet boxers in person, including a magnificent and very rare white boxer running around the house in the background. But I often send my listeners to his shows way back then to get a basic exposure and some simple practical tips for how to live a healthier lifestyle. So Tommy has been this great resource for so long, but in real life, he's a brain researcher specializing in pediatric brain injuries. He has a beautiful lab at the University of Washington that he operates to study how to heal the brain from injury. And finally, after a decade of being at the top of his profession, he has cranked out an amazing book that is going to be of broad general interest to everyone to escape from this very disastrous pattern of accelerated decline and increasing rates of cognitive decline, dementia, and related disease. If you haven't heard these stats and you're not afraid, you might be afraid pretty soon. Come out from under the rock. In the next 15 to 20 years, the burden of dementia is expected to at least double, if not triple worldwide, becoming either the first or second most common cause of death in most high-income countries by 2040. Tommy is going to explain that you can relax, calm down, and not worry about getting struck down randomly by this devastating and tragic disease, but instead that your brain health is determined by your environment. Your environmental inputs. We have a great show getting the overview, but I really encourage you to purchase this book and read it, enjoy it, listen to him recording it. It's called The Stimulated Mind. You can pre-order it right now and get a bunch of bonus items that Tommy mentions. But the book is organized into 3 different parts, so Tommy kind of breezes through the various sections. The first section is getting into the science and the history of brain research, and then we get practical, which Tommy is so good at. And so he talks about the second section with his 5 tips: move, nourish, stimulate, connect, and adapt, and what those really mean, the behaviors that you might want to avoid if you're interested in brain health, and the ways that we can protect from some of the recent challenges like this hyperconnectivity, chronic overstimulation of the brain, and understand how it's way beyond some of these lip service that we hear about doing Sudoku puzzles when you're a senior so you can stay sharp in the brain. That helps, but it's not the whole picture. Tommy is going to give you the big picture right here in this show. So please listen all the way to the end, because you are going to learn the 3 S's that are the key to long-term brain health and disease prevention. And at the very end, he gives you, I said, give me 3 quick tips, quick takeaways for someone who is short on time to dive deep into a whole new book and just wants to improve brain health. And he fires off 3 that you can do right now to improve your cognitive performance today and also prevent that accelerated decline. A little bioinformation. Tommy works with some leading athletes in the world, including Formula One drivers and professional sports teams. He studied at Cambridge and Oxford in England, and then he got his PhD in University of Oslo, now at the University of Washington, Associate Professor of Pediatrics and Neuroscience. Busy guy, but taking the time out to connect with us. So I'm so glad to share this show with you. Tommy's also a super athlete, so he walks his talk and he competes in the Masters Division strongman competitions. So I know you're going to enjoy this entire show and the book, The Stimulated Mind. I had a great time reading the advanced copy. So let's hear from Dr. Tommy Wood. Dr. Tommy Wood, author of The Stimulated Mind, Future-Proof Your Brain from Dementia and Stay Sharp at Any Age. What a great title and subtitle. I'm so excited to talk to you and excited to hear about this book launch. And we're gonna get into it on a very, very important subject. So thanks for connecting.
Yeah, great. Awesome to see you and be back again. We've had a number of fantastic conversations on the podcast previously, so I'm really, really excited to be back.
Yeah, now
And
the listeners have to go back and listen to our epic 3 shows. It was great to meet you in person. It was now several years ago up in Washington,
yeah,
and now we're using the magic of the internet to connect. But those were some of my favorite shows and most commented and most appreciated shows. And I think the best thing that came out of it with your high level of expertise and scientific knowledge and study, but you have a great ability to kind of share complex topics in a simple and memorable way. And I'm not going to say that I'm now an expert on the material, reading about the ganglia and the 3 different types of ganglia, but I got the gist of it. And there's always great takeaway paragraphs where even someone who's a lay person and just wants to know how to get better or not get dementia, that's what I think is a credit to the book. But it also is a completely thorough explanation of how the brain works, and I want to get into some of your favorite talking points. And people better be listening up because it's a pretty important organ, huh?
yeah, I think so. And over my career, I've sort of gravitated more and more towards the brain. Obviously, I did my PhD in neuroscience, but then even the more time I spend working with athletes, the more time I spend in the lab, the more you kind of see people struggling with their brains out in the world and worrying about their brains. In adults over 40, dementia is their number one health concern. So knowing that there's a ton we can do there, I think it's important to start getting the word out.
Before we get into the practical steps we can take, maybe you can give us a little bit of background, particularly your scientific course of study. We can get a summary there, but also how you kind of landed on working with high-level athletes, because that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so the sort of the academic part of my CV is I did most of my training in the UK. I did an undergraduate degree in biochemistry at the University of Cambridge, then a medical degree at the University of Oxford. I worked as a junior doctor in London for a couple of years before moving to Oslo to do a PhD in physiology and neuroscience, and that was kind of where I really started to get interested in neuroscience. And then I'm now a faculty member and associate professor at the University of Washington. I've been here for about 10 years now, and I run a big sort of neuroscience lab trying to find ways to treat the injured brain. But pretty much starting as an undergrad, first I was a rower, so I rowed at both Cambridge and Oxford, and then increasingly became interested in coaching. So I was like club captain in multiple places, and then I was head coach of the medical school boat club at Oxford, and sort of through that time, kind of trying to leverage what I'm learning, in the lecture halls in biochemistry and physiology and medicine, and trying to sort of apply that to athletic performance. And during my PhD, I started to work with a company. This is how you and I met, called Nourish, Balance, Thrive, now 10 or 15 years ago. And working with athletes to improve all aspects of their health and performance. Lots of masters athletes trying to stay competitive and perform well for long periods of time. And through that, did some health blogs, some podcasting, connected with a company called Hinsa Performance, which oversees medical and coaching, and coaching services for a number of Formula One drivers. So I'm now head scientist for motorsport at Hinsa Performance. So my job is to kick the tires on the science for all the stuff that might relate to health and performance for several Formula One drivers. And that's really my sort of main foray into professional sports. Right now, I do a little bit of consulting with some other professional sports, particularly as it relates to like blood work and nutrient status and some of these other kinds of things. And then all those things kind of come together to help me think about what are the aspects that are really required to build and then maintain or enhance cognitive function, and ideally long term prevent cognitive decline.
So what led you to start this book project? Because you've been at this great work for many years, like you mentioned, and then all of a sudden you're gonna cough up a book.
uh, yeah, so I feel like writing is one of my best mediums. I really enjoy writing, and that's a big part of my job as a scientist, where I have to write grant proposals and papers and all that kind of thing. This, like, writing a science book, an accessible health book for the general population, is a very, very different type of writing, of course. So part of it was, this was a new challenge for me, and I'd gotten to a point in my career where I now have a big team of people who work in my lab. They're amazing. They get the day-to-day work done. So I have the capacity to kind of spend a little time working on another project like a book. And so, like, I couldn't have done it without them, because they're the ones sort of keeping the lights on and getting the work done. And then I also got to the point where I felt like there's a book that's needed that doesn't exist. And it's like, when people come to me and they're like, "Hey, Tommy, tell me what I should do for my brain."
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't really quite have the book that I would want to give you. They're either very science heavy, very technical, and some of the like longevity and dementia books are kind of like that, or they focus on just like one area. There was nothing that sort of, I felt, gives people an accessible and sort of like comprehensible sort of toolkit and guide for brain health. And like cognitive performance today, like a big part of it is like, how do I perform better today, right? Because I know that people are asking those questions, and because of like all those different threads of work that I work in, I was seeing the same things being important again and again and again. So I also felt confident that this was a book that would be relevant at least for a few years, right? Because many books, like, you write them, like you finish writing the book, like the book will be published almost a year after I finished writing it, right? So it's very easy to write a book, and then by the time it comes out, it's no longer relevant. So at least I felt like the topics in here are always going to be relevant, regardless of what happens in the future. So I felt confident that it would be a meaningful contribution.
I'd say that's a fair bet because of the education and learning how the brain works. The neurons are only 50% of the cells in the brain. What? So you organize the book into these three parts, and if you want, unless you have a better idea, I thought you could kind of like take us through the parts of the book and your favorite talking points.
Yeah. So the first part is kind of a little bit of how do we get here in terms of neuroscience and how we think about the brain. Why haven't we done a better job of treating neurological diseases including Alzheimer's disease? And so this is where I tell the story of how we've historically studied the brain, including Alzheimer. When he was looking at his original patients, and this is really driven by the fact that we take slices of a dead person's brain and we look at them under a microscope. And this is something that we do in my lab, but there is this massive gulf between what we can learn about the brain when it's in a slide under a microscope versus what that brain was like out in the real world, and all the things that sort of affected it and resulted in it having the consciousness and the complex thought processes that it did, right? But because we've been so focused on how brains look under the microscope, we've kind of missed a lot of the bigger picture, right? We're very focused on proteins, amyloid, tau, all these different things. And those are an important part of aging in the brain and of dementia risk. But then they're not most of it. Actually, most of it seems to be related to other factors. And so the kind of towards the end of that first part, I talk about how we can sort of step back, and rather than getting into the sort of really nitty gritty details and mechanisms and all those things that neuroscientists like, we can realize and appreciate that there are these core biological inputs driven by the environment that are the primary determinants of how our brains function and age. And so I actually start part one with the preface is about some studies in owls that I quite like. And what they did, these are classic studies done in at Stanford. And I will say that every other study I reference in the book is in humans, but like the owl story is quite nice. So that they took these owls, barn owls, and they put prism glasses on them. And so, like, a prism is a thing that shifts light. So when you put these prism glasses, you can Google these studies. They're run by Eric Knudsen, and you can see like these cool pictures of barn owls with like these sort of like crazy spectacles on. And the light gets shifted in coming into their eyes, so that where they think they see something is not where it actually is. Right? There's like a mismatch between where they see something and like the representation of the world in the brains of the owls. And this is a representation that we all have in our brains. Like, we expect things to be in a certain place. We hear something, and if we have like 3D hearing, right, both our ears are working. We have some idea where something is in 3D space. Owls are the same. And what they found was that if you're a young owl, you adapt to these glasses very quickly. But if you're an older owl, you're an adult owl, you don't. And then
that has nothing to do with humans then.
Well, so this is the interesting thing, is it has a lot to do with what we think about the adult human brain, right? We think that the adult human brain is fixed, and there's nothing that we can do to change it. And if I told you that owls, if I like stopped the owl story there, you'd be like, oh yeah, of course, like, adult brain is fixed, you can't change it. But they did two different things that showed that this wasn't the case. So one was in the original owl experiments, they have owls housed in individual cages, and they get fed dead mice, which is I kind of say it's like the perfect metaphor for modern human life. You're like alone in your own box, and like food just shows up, and you don't have to do anything else. But if they house them socially, like multiple owls in a cage, right? So now you're having to like interact and navigate other beings in your space, and you have some social interaction. Then they found that the adult brain could adapt much later, right? Because the owl was needing to adapt because there are other owls it has to interact with. And then another version of the experiment they did is, rather than feeding the owl dead mice, it had to hunt live mice. Live mice get released into the cage, and the animal has to hunt them. And what they saw was that as the owl got better at hunting, there was a shift in the internal map of the world in the brain of the owls, even in adults. So all of this saying that the adult brain is absolutely capable of change, even very late in life, 60s, 70s, 80s, and we have tons of studies that show this. But it requires active engagement in the environment and some reason to change, right? You need to tell your brain that it's important that it change. And so we see the same thing in humans. So this whole idea being that if we kind of step back from some of the like really basic nitty-gritty neuroscience and just appreciate that the primary driver of brain function is how we engage with the world, and telling our brain that it's important to engage with the world, your brain can change and adapt and improve, like even decades later in life.
So an example might be showing up in some foreign country and saying, I'm going to learn the language. Gosh darn it, here I am at 60 or 70 or 80 or whatever.
Yeah, 100%. So this then leads us into so I kind of, at the end of that first part, I say we need to learn how to play the game of brain health, right? It's not thinking about like all the individual mechanisms. We need to like, how do we play the game of being a human that kind of helps to support our brains? And so the chapters then in the next part go through all the different areas where we can see significant improvements in cognitive function based on how we engage with the world. So physical activity, all the different ways that different types of exercise affect different parts of the brain. Nutrition, all those sort of important parts of nutrition for brain function. Stimulus, and so right? The book's called The Stimulated Mind. I make the case that how we use our brains is the primary determinant of how our brains function. And so we need to stimulate our brains with challenging tasks and skills. So learning languages is one great example. There are multiple studies in older adults showing that if you learn a new language, you see significant changes in the structure of the brain and improvements in important cognitive functions like executive function, decision making. We see the same thing when you learn a musical instrument. We see the same thing when you take some kind of some new sport that requires you to like react to the environment and have a strategy or learning complex motor skills like dancing or pickleball or skateboarding or something like that. And then other important things come into like stress management or reframing stress, like sleep and adaptation. Then I also talk a little bit about the importance of cardiovascular health, hormonal health, alcohol, smoking, all that, those kinds of things too. And so, like you said, like this core idea that going out into the world and challenging yourself, right? Insert yourself in a new country and speak a new language, or it could be a lot less daunting than that. It could be anything that there's a complex skill that requires you to sort of challenge yourself and fail. Failure is actually the primary, and mistakes are the primary driver of neuroplasticity in the brain, right? You imagine your owl trying to hunt, and the first time, right, she misses the mouse, but every time she misses, she gets a little frustrated, right? She's hungry. And like each time you do that, there's this signal in the brain to kind of slowly shift and improve itself. And it's the same when we like make a mistake conjugating a vowel or a verb in like Spanish or French. But that is what drives neuroplasticity. So that is I think the most important thing that we can do to sort of start to build additional function in the brain.
So we hear about how great that is to try new things, and we use the example of going to a foreign country. Can it also be adaptive and beneficial to, let's say, stick with the same challenge? A lifelong golfer trying to get better and master this frustrating game. It doesn't have to always be new stuff. I'm assuming that you try to become better and better and better at something that you love for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's benefit to new skills, and we know that the learning curve is fastest early on. So like I would get relatively much faster at golf than you do because you're a much better golfer than I am, right? So I have that learning curve is steepest for me if I take it up.
Yeah, but I can double my deadlift in about 6 weeks, and there's no way you can.
Exactly. Yeah. So and there's benefit to both of us doing that, right?
Yeah.
Having something, a new challenge that kind of builds a new skill set or a new sort of like physical set of capacities. But there's also really interesting data on the development of expertise. So there's a very nice study that came out recently called Creative Experiences and Brain Clocks. And what they did was they measured electrical activity in the brain to kind of develop like a brain age. So there are specific networks in the brain that are susceptible to the processes of aging. Things like the frontoparietal network, which is really, really important for attention and memory. And these networks kind of erode over time. Like they become less discrete and well connected, and they become like a bit fuzzier. And so like then like paying attention is a little harder, remembering things is a little harder. But when they looked at creative art, so they had artists like painters, they had tango dancers, they had musicians, and what they found was that in experts compared to amateurs, there was better maintenance of the function of these networks because of like the expertise that they've developed in this specific area. And so I would put golf absolutely in that same arena, right? Because it requires very specific like motor coordination. You have to respond to the environment, respond to the elements, planning, strategy, all those kinds of things. So when we have these multi-sensory complex skills, and we, work to achieve mastery in them, it seems to have, like, regardless of what that skill is, as long as it sort of fits those criteria, they seem to have very similar benefits in terms of maintaining the function of the brain as we age.
So if you're good at something that's really, really complex.
Yes.
What if you're a dabbler at 27 different things? Could that kind of meet the same checkpoint?
Yes, I think so. Obviously coming at it from a different direction. And what's interesting is that you see, regardless of the skill that you're learning, right? So languages, like there's really interesting data on like complex first-person video games, right? Immersive worlds. You're having to learn new motor skills, problem solve, like rapidly respond to the environment. And across all of these, they seem to help to maintain some of these core decision-making and processing systems in the brain. So that's kind of like the more sort of like detailed studies. But then when you look at the activities that are associated with a lower risk of dementia, again, as people get older, being involved in at least one or two things every day, that is like sort of like complex or novel in some way, and is challenging in some way. So it's like reading, writing, attending lectures, going to classes, volunteering, sports, dancing, right? If you do one or two of those things every day, those are the people who are the best protected against dementia long term. So if you're somebody who just prefers a smorgasbord of things to try out, then I think that's going to have some similar benefits as well.
We always hear the familiar example of do your Sudoku puzzles and keep your brain sharp. But I'm imagining when you use those 5 categories in the book, they're called move, nourish, stimulate, connect, and adapt. And you mentioned sort of things relating to those 5, but that's how the book's organized. I imagine that it's important to hit more than one. So if you're just sitting around doing complex work on a computer screen, that's great for your brain. But if you don't exercise and you don't eat nourishing food and so forth, you're not going to get a good score on that risk factors.
Yes. So in your first question related to like Sudoku and crosswords, like that's kind of the things that's the thing that when you say like use it or lose it, right? That's the thing that people imagine first. I'm going to do Sudokus, right, when I retire. And they can be nice as like they're a certain type of it's almost like a mental break, right? Gloria Mark, who's a psychologist who studies how we like maintain productivity at work without feeling burnt out and stressed. She has a way of categorizing different cognitive stimuli and how we use our brains. And so one she calls rote activities, which require focus but aren't cognitively challenging. And that's where you find Sudoku and crosswords and things. So they're kind of like they're nice to do, and they can be great to do, but that's not the same as taking a new dance class or inserting yourself into a foreign country and trying to learn the language. Like, it's just vastly different in terms of the level of challenge. So some of those things can be beneficial, but you also need to like really push yourself. That's important too. When we get into like part 3 of the book, all of those different areas that we mentioned, I kind of bring together in this model for how I think the brain works that I call the 3S model. The first S is stimulation. Or stimulus. And that's kind of the stuff that we've talked about so far. And I think that stimulus is the primary driver of cognitive function. And I provide lots of evidence for that. And I kind of make a parallels to physical function. So we know if you want to get bigger and stronger, the most important thing you can do is lift weights, right?
What about sitting and thinking about getting bigger and stronger?
So,
does that help?
Well, so there are some interesting studies about like that suggest there's like a placebo effect that like if you visualize yourself getting stronger, you do get a bit stronger. So a little bit of that, but mainly the most important thing,
making noise, clanking some plates.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can get a better adaptation an outcome from your training if you attend to nutrition and sleep and recovery and all these things. But, I would wish that I could just nap and drink protein shakes and get super, super jacked. But like that, unfortunately, that's just not gonna happen, right? I need to go to the gym and do some work. So stimulus is the most important thing. But when you stimulate a part of the brain, that part of the brain then needs a supply, that's my second S, of oxygen, some kind of metabolic substrate, right? Often it's glucose, could be ketones, could be lactate. And then some kind of, then the nutrients that kind of make the brain run. So things like omega-3s are really important, B vitamins are really important, vitamin D is really important, magnesium, zinc, antioxidant polyphenols like you get from berries do really cool things for the brain. So you need all of that to kind of come in when the brain is stimulated. And then like the adaptation and the improvement in function, just like with exercise, happens when you rest and you recover, right? So this is my third S, support. So sleep is a critical part of support. Other things that are important in support are like hormonal health can make a big difference. And the production of factors that kind of support changes in function in the brain, like we call them trophic factors, like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which you release during exercise. And then we want to avoid things that kind of inhibit that adaptation. So alcohol, smoking, chronic stress, which chronic stress basically creates like an overtraining picture in the brain, right? You never like switch off. You can never fully recover. And so all of these things then kind of interact. And I'm kind of getting to your point about sitting and working like your brain all day and not supporting in other ways. So yes, the stimulus is the most important thing. But if you want to get the most out of it, you need to hit those other buckets too. But importantly, they interact, right? So if you take an older adult, so they've done studies in individuals sort of like 65 and older, and you give them a brain training program, they end up sleeping better because when you stimulate your brain tissue, you create a greater drive and need for sleep and recovery and adaptation. So, and it's the same thing when we exercise. We know when we exercise more, we sleep better. Similarly, if we like start to sleep better, then we become more social the next day. We're more likely to engage in cognitive stimulating tasks. We might see improvements in blood pressure or blood sugar because we're sleeping better. So yes, we need to attend to all those different things. But equally, if you just change one thing, you start to see benefits like all over the network because they interact.
One of the messages that you get hit with a lot is, our drink contains the ideal electrolyte profile. So in developing Super Drink, looking at all the research, you know what we discovered is the ideal electrolyte profile? There's no such thing. There is no science to validate that you need this many grams of this to have the ideal electrolyte profile. It's the performance agents that you really want to go looking for when you're consuming an electrolyte, hydration, and performance drink. So we added creatine, citrulline, taurine, and an essential amino acid group to help your muscles perform better, recover faster, and even improve concentration, motivation, and that brain neuron performance that's so important for physical athletic performance. A Super Drink is a high performance electrolyte, hydration, recovery drink, great for during and after workouts, and also to sip everywhere all day to keep you hydrated, focused, and energized. We made a nice light drink. I like to mix it even lighter than a full packet so I can sip it throughout the day. Your choice. You can mix it strong, you can mix it light, but you're gonna love it. B-Rad Super Drink. So where are we mainly falling short in modern life? You hear about this go, go, go hectic pace and the hyperconnectivity, which I guess could fall in the category of chronic stress. But also there seems to be this is where all the fear comes in, and the mystery and the uncertainty is people are walking around with their fingers crossed, hoping that they don't get chosen for that unfortunate lottery like Aunt Judy did, and that's where we're kind of shrouded in fear and anxiety about this increasing the increasing rates of cognitive decline.
Yeah, and understandably so. And although I will say that there's some interesting data that suggests that at the population level, we're now less likely to be diagnosed with dementia at the age of 70 than we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. So some things have improved, and a lot of that people think comes from treating and preventing heart disease. We're much better at that than we used to be, and heart disease risk factors overlap with dementia risk factors. And there's a few other things like women in the workforce only really expanded in the 1970s in the US, and we know that complex cognitively stimulating work is important for dementia prevention. So that's maybe having an effect now. So lots of things have kind of changed in a beneficial way, but we're now at a point where we're going to be living longer, and the metabolic health of the population has continued to get worse. And so now people are thinking that, you know, risks might start to tick up again because of those two things. So I think depending on where you are in life, sort of if you're, you know, you got some degrees and you have complex cognitively stimulating work and you have good social connection and you do some kind of sport that requires you to like interact with other people, right? You're probably ticking the stimulus box pretty well, right?
Right.
You're covering most of the things that you need. So then in that group, two things are very prevalent. One is metabolic disease, and we know that metabolic disease, like high blood pressure, high blood sugar, are significant risk factors for dementia. But then the other one is they're stimulating, but they're not giving themselves time to rest and recover and adapt, right? They're not sleeping enough during the day, constantly multitasking, constantly task switching, never giving your brain any kind of time to like switch off and recover. And it just takes a few minutes of like a proper break to then like come back and be able to do more hard thinking again. And then because of that, right, we never actually get high quality work done because we're so scattered and all over the place. And then we get stressed because we can't focus on the work that we need to do, and it sort of like all snowballs from there. So that group, I think, needs to focus on restructuring how they approach work, giving themselves time to sleep and recover and adapt so they can benefit from all the other things that they're doing. But then when you get later in life, you know, especially as you approach retirement, then there's sort of like certainly the nutrient status and the metabolic health stuff sort of remains relevant. But then stimulus becomes more important, because what happens is we see that when people retire, that's the point at which cognitive decline declines. Cognitive decline is the most rapid. And then the other one is when we have prolonged periods of illness. And because we're not stimulating ourselves, we're just lying in bed, not doing anything. And so then we need to actively work harder to keep stimulating our brains so they maintain function. So I think the focus needs to kind of shift depending on where we are in that cycle of like our careers and our lifespan.
Right. It seems like a lot of people are caught in the wrong categories, like overstimulated, chronically stressed during a stressful work career, and then pulling the plug, retiring, and then falling below that threshold of a healthy cognitive daily challenge.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whew. If we hit those checkpoints really well, the stimulus, the supply, the support, getting enough sleep, getting enough nutrition, getting enough cognitive challenge, how do you like one's odds? Is there still some randomness where 4% are going to be totally host, even though they had this amazing, healthy, active, energetic, cognitively stimulating life?
Yes. So right now, we know that people who are at high risk, either from a health standpoint or a genetic standpoint, you can offset a lot of that risk by engaging all the things that we've talked about, right? So genetic risk factors like your ApoE genotype, which is the most common single genetic risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease. If you have a copy of ApoE4, your risk of Alzheimer's may be like 2 to 6 times higher. If you have 2 copies, it might be 6 to 20 times higher. But it's mainly
6 to 20 times higher than an average person.
Yeah, but then the
Right.
average person who doesn't have. So they usually benchmark against an APO-3/3, which is like just the average. So like APOE2s have lower risk, APOE3s, which are the most common, have like the standard risk, and APOE4s have higher risk on average. And the E4 is like it's mainly a risk multiplier. So you just get a bigger negative effect on your risk of dementia if you're then sedentary, or you drink a lot of alcohol, or you have a poor quality diet, right? But then by the same token, if you address those things, you get more benefit, right? Because you're offsetting that risk. So all of this to say that if you're at higher risk, we know we can address that risk. The problem is that nothing is certain, right? We're talking about probabilities. I'm talking about stacking the deck in your favor to minimize your risk. And there is some proportion of dementias that we just don't understand enough about yet to know whether we can meaningfully move the needle on that. Right now, it's estimated that 45 to 70-ish% of dementias are preventable, largely by addressing lifestyle, environmental, and some socioeconomic, like societal risk factors. But that obviously leaves some percentage, maybe a quarter or more of dementias where risk is still there, and we're still trying to understand the risk of those dementias that we don't yet think are preventable. So we can't prevent dementia entirely, but we can dramatically decrease risk. We can extend the period of time when we maintain good cognitive function. And so then if we do sort of stretch that window out, that horizon out, maybe we'll die of something else first before we experience cognitive decline of dementia. Or if we do get dementia, we'll get it much later, and maybe we'll have less of a symptom burden. So regardless of where you look on that scale, I think we can have a big impact.
Is it possible to arrest cognitive decline almost completely, where we don't say the same thing with our strength, our power, our explosiveness, our endurance, but you see examples of elderly people who are extremely sharp. Maybe there's some measurement that they've fallen off since they were 60 when they're 90 or something, but I wonder how that lines up with the inevitable physical decline that you can stave off really nicely with fitness practices, but not entirely.
Yeah. So I think there are definitely going to be some parallels to loss of fitness, strength, power, right? Power probably being one thing that we lose fastest, because we can't prevent aging entirely. Like that's not something.
Some people disagree, Tommy, and they have very popular podcasts. So
yeah,
maybe you can argue with them when you're on those podcasts.
Right now, the burden of proof is in my favor, so I'm okay with that. I will say that most of the things that we've talked about here, when we don't do them, we accelerate the processes of aging. So it's not that we're slowing aging. It's basically that we're making sure we're not making aging go faster. Does that make sense? It's kind of like it's kind of the other way around.
It's exactly hand in hand with all the physical information that we know, and the consequences of being inactive and accelerating that demise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
kind of refreshing to realize that these all go hand in hand, especially when one of your pillars is physical activity to support brain health.
100%. Absolutely one of the most important. Physical activity is like the only thing that I know of that addresses all of the biological hallmarks of aging. And a lot of that is because being physically inactive accelerates those processes, right? So anything we can do to kind of maintain and build movement can have a massive effect. So yeah, as we get older, we probably will lose some types of specific functions in the brain, but what you see is not that cognitive function just declines overall. You see a shift in the balance of different functions. So yes, absolute processing speed or reaction time or something like that might get worse eventually. But we as long as we're sort of like maintaining overall cognitive function and we're ticking all those boxes, we even into our like 60s and 70s, we see improvements in things that we call crystallized intelligence. So this is the fancy neuroscience word for wisdom. Like how are we taking all the things that we know and the bigger picture of the world and kind of fitting them into, a holistic model so that we can have, a better kind of idea of how the world works. And then ideally help other people learn those, have a transfer of knowledge to the next generation. So yes, certain functions decline, but other functions continue to improve as long as you're still maintaining the overall health of the system.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, the more experience, it's got to be good if you are applying yourself and staying focused and not
Yeah.
overstimulated and doing the deep work and all those great suggestions. So,
Yeah.
but are there any Formula One drivers over 60?
No, there are a
Zero?
couple. I'm trying to remember. There was in former eras of Formula One when it was just kind of like a hobby of the rich and famous.
Mm.
Yes, there were drivers into their 50s, maybe
Wow.
their 60s as well. Nowadays, there are 2 drivers on the grid right now who are in their 40s.
Ah.
So we've certainly sort of pushed that envelope, similar to, Tom Brady,
Yeah.
LeBron James, Ronaldo in soccer, or what I would call football. So I think we're getting better at maintaining function for longer by being, very focused on training. I think we've done a better job of kind of extending performance out into our 40s at like the highest level. But yeah, of course, you're gonna lose a step. You're gonna lose a little bit of function once you get to a certain point. But then, right, all the accumulated experience, all the time they've spent learning how their sport works, they'll then be in a great position to kind of stay engaged in that and use that wisdom then to teach others or however they want to do it. And it's interesting because often you'll see older drivers perform better because, right, they're a little less impulsive, they're a little more thoughtful, right? They're applying a little more sort of bigger picture stuff. And this like continues in humans as they get older into the sort of like 5th, 6th, 7th decade.
In any area. I can kind of reference my writing efforts, which have been going on for many decades, and I can no longer crank out for a lengthy number of hours like I might have been able to in my 30s, but I feel like I can get the finished product done faster in less time because I'm a better writer.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like this amazing trade-off where
Yeah.
both are fine, but it's kind of one of the goals of getting older is to get that crystallized wisdom. It's a great term.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we can kind of eliminate this accelerated decline that we're seeing all around us and generating so much fear by hitting those 3 checkpoints, doing the right things. Again, move, nourish, stimulate, connect, and adapt. And you mentioned the owls interacting socially, and I've heard you talking numerous times about the benefits of social connection and the dangers of loneliness as one of the major factors contributing to brain decline today. So maybe we could hit that pillar a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years ago, it's like 3 or 4 years ago now, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Josh Turknett, who's a neurologist, we wrote a paper essentially hypothesizing that the primary driver of cognitive decline in older adults is that they no longer stimulate their brains in the way that we know drives function. And that this has kind of formed a core sort of thesis of the book. And shortly after it came out, I met up with a good friend of mine. He's called Julian Abel. He's a retired palliative care physician in the UK. And he was like, I'm sure this is right, but it's all driven by humans' core need for social connection and social interaction with other humans. And it's interesting that when you think about evolutionary drivers of like what allowed humans to become who they are, it seems that our complex social structures plus the requirement to then look after past generations or look after like future generations, right, your own offspring and the community, and pass information down, seems to be part of what drove like how complex our brains are. And there was a theory from Charles Darwin that came out more than a decade after the origin of species, which was like survival of the fittest, evolution, all that kind of stuff. He wrote a separate he wrote a separate doctrine called the descent of man. And he realized that like an every person for themselves approach doesn't explain human evolution. And he eventually said that the group of individuals who spend the most time looking after each other are the ones who are most likely to survive and be like fittest in the environment. And so then this got renamed, and I think popularized by a guy from UC Berkeley called Daka Keltner as survival of the kindest. And like that's the kind of the primary driver of evolution in humans. And so what this means is that as social animals, our connection to others is a primary driver of our physiology, and then how that knocks on and affects our health. So one of the like coolest things you can see from data is that when we have the opportunities for pro-social behavior, like helping others, and that could be spouses, it could be friends, it could be volunteering, right? It activates the vagus nerve, decreases stress responses. It seems to shift the immune system, right? So you have less of like a pro-inflammatory state. And it doesn't even have to be humans. Like you see the same thing if you have like pets or dogs, right? It's this core need for us to like look after other beings. And when we get opportunities to do that, we see significant, decreases in mortality risk, dementia risk. And so we know that if you're socially isolated and you feel lonely, then you have an elevated risk of cognitive decline and dementia. And it's very interesting that when they've looked at studies of individuals who are socially isolated, so they've done this with individuals in social isolation in prisons, in Arctic explorers who are like off in the wilderness, like by themselves for months. They've looked at there have been studies done trying to understand how astronauts would deal with isolation in space. Right, you go to Mars, there's like 3 of you. Like, what's this going to do to the brain? And you see that these areas of the brain that are most susceptible to decreases in function as we age are the areas of the brain that are negatively impacted by being socially isolated, right? So social isolation drives aging processes in the brain, right? Fascinating. And it all seems to come down to this like core need that we have to connect with others, and maybe like the most important part of that being our ability and opportunities to help others and support them.
Now that we're in a digital world for the first time in recorded history, escalating in the past 20 years, can digital do any type of positive benefit to replace, like a lot of elderly have the news on all day long in their house, so there's a voice talking to them, and it seems like, well, maybe it's better than just having it quiet all day long. But I know that we hear about how digital interferes with social connection and interaction. Is there any way to like circumvent if we have somewhat more of a narrow life and we're not out socializing like crazy like we did in decades past, for example?
Yeah, so a lot of the most interesting research around this was actually done during COVID because of the lockdowns. You like had an opportunity to kind of study very sudden changes in social connection and how that affects people. And then there's also some of the history of social media. There's a lot of research there as well. So like Facebook originally, rather than being a place to like sell you stuff and then sell your data, originally it was a place where you could like post photos and connect with friends and family, right? That's
Really? Wow,
that's what it was.
fascinating.
Like 20 years ago, that's what Facebook looked like. And so in that setting, there seems to be potential for net benefit. And you see in older adults adopting new technologies like Facebook or social media, and across individuals who use social media or like video or chat, WhatsApp, right? If you're creating or maintaining social connections that you wouldn't have done otherwise, there seems to be a net benefit. Of course, the closer it is to the kind of stuff that you would do in person, the better, right? So video is better than calls, and calls are better than messaging in that kind of order. But if you're creating a connection that you wouldn't have had otherwise, there's net benefit. If you're using online connection instead of in-person connection you could have had otherwise, then there's a net negative. And that kind of goes from using like social media to kind of connect with with people, right? DMs or whatever, down to like the worst being just using it to consume content, right? Which seems to have, and like commenting on posts or consuming content seems to have like a net negative, especially when you're doing that instead of in-person connection.
So to use it to maximum benefit would be sending thoughtful, compose a text message to a friend who you haven't seen in a while.
Exactly.
Vastly superior to scrolling through and getting stimulated by random content.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so like I have family on the other side of the world. If I can use Zoom or WhatsApp to stay in contact with them, that's a net benefit, right? Because I can't always be there with them in person. But if I'm not doing that and instead I'm just like scrolling through Instagram, right, that's a net negative. So I think, and like conceptually this makes sense. And like this is kind of what emerges from the research.
I'd say probably everyone's nodding their head, acknowledging that and aware of that. The problem is we tend to slip or lose focus or lose willpower. You hear how the geniuses behind these platforms are very clever at drawing you in and by design trying to get you to waste time rather than compose a bunch of thoughtful messages to your friends with the magic of the device in your hand. So it's like a challenge to use it to your advantage rather than disadvantage.
Yeah, and there are a few different ways to navigate this. So there are certainly studies where people like go cold turkey, right? You just quit social media immediately. And it's interesting. It's similar. There are similar like studies on quitting smoking, right? Early on, it sucks. People hate it. Like they're craving the nicotine. They're getting the FOMO because they're not on Instagram. But then like once you get several weeks past that, right, they feel much better. Mood improves, well-being improves, especially if they start to replace social media with in-person human interaction. So like it's just interesting that when, depending on the study you look at, if it's a short-term study, people are like, oh, I hate that I had to give up Instagram. But you're asking them a week after, right? When they're still, that's like part of they haven't adapted to it. Whereas if you keep like a longer time horizon, they start to feel better. And then you can do other things like even though the algorithm is in charge of what it shows you to an extent, you can pick who you follow, right?
Right.
So, right, you have control over
changes according to your behavior, right?
Yeah. So you can use social media as a cognitive break, like truly, right? If your social media is full of dogs doing silly things, which is a lot of mine, and you want to spend 5 minutes doing that after an hour of really hard cognitive work and focus, great, right? Actually, there's good evidence for that, but you have to craft what's on there, right? So you have to direct the algorithm to show you that stuff. We can use that. We can use it regularly, but we have to mold our usage of it such that it's giving us a net benefit. So equally, right, you can use Facebook just to connect with family members. Like there's nothing that says that you can't do that, right? But then it requires a little bit of conscious effort up front such that becomes the primary way that you use it.
Yeah, I have to buy stuff too because they're telling me I need to buy it right now. It's on sale for only 12 more minutes. Yeah. You mentioned smoking and alcohol kind of in passing back when we were talking about Nourish. So
yeah,
maybe we could include all the other substances that seem to be increasingly popular today, legalized recreational prescription substances, as well as the processed diet and the very popular alcohol and smoking.
Yes. So maybe we'll go in reverse order. smoking essentially has a linear relationship with dementia risk. So the more you smoke, the higher the risk. So that's an easy one. Like it's one of the biggest risk factors for strokes, depression, dementia. Like these are like the big three neurological disorders that impact. At this point, the majority of the world may experience one or more of those over time. So right, that's an easy one to tick off. But then you might ask about other nicotine related products. Certainly, things like gums and patches, much less of a problem than smoking. Vaping, they're still kind of understanding some of the long-term cognitive effects, but there's some suggestion that primarily because of the things that are in there, like the excipients and the solvents that they kind of use in the vapes, there's probably a net negative effect on the brain and overall health there as well. Nicotine is tricky because in small doses, like 1 to 4 milligrams of nicotine, in trials, it actually boosts focus and attention, right? Because acetylcholine, where nicotine acts, is really important for that. And so some people, promote nicotine as a nootropic. It is not a nootropic because a nootropic requires it to have no side effects, not be addictive, and not create tolerance, where you need to have bigger and bigger doses to have the same effect. So it ticks none of the boxes for a nootropic, and it is addictive. So
come on, what do you know, Dr. Tommy? Oh, mercy. It's great to hear. I don't know if listeners are fully aware, but there's sort of this undercurrent of people promoting nootropic, meanings helping brain performance. And so people are pitching nicotine as this awesome concentration tool, which I kind of scoff at. So now I got to hear from a trained professional that it's not a nootropic. Okay, thumbs up.
Yeah, so... And like people occasionally using a non-damaging source of nicotine for like focus on a specific task, fine. But like don't think that you can keep going back to that well every day and it's not going to have some negative effects. Like we know that it likely will. Then right, alcohol is the next one. The alcohol is always interesting because people always want you to tell them that the level of alcohol that they consume is the right level, and that's whether it's none or some. Right, or every day. And so I think that the best evidence that we have is that there is no net benefit to consuming alcohol. Like previously we thought that like small amounts might be beneficial. And like still, like if you drink, like a small glass of wine a day on average, right? Like kind of like the typical thing that people try and promote. There's maybe a slight benefit in terms of cardiovascular risk, but then there's a slight negative effect in terms of cancer risk and maybe stroke risk. So like the net effect on your health is zero. When it comes to the brain, it seems like 1 or 2 drinks a week is fine. Once you're drinking every day or consuming like several drinks per week, we start to see higher dementia risk. We start to see smaller brain volumes, which we know then translates to higher dementia risk. So have the occasional drink that you enjoy with your friends, but if it's something that you're consuming every day, then I think there's suggestions that it's going to be a net negative for the brain. We know it negatively affects sleep, right? Particularly it creates a REM sleep deficit, which is really important for like emotional processing and creative problem solving and creating like connections and wisdom, right? Wisdom is really important, right? REM sleep is a big part of that. Other things that you can think about, obviously, with the legalization of cannabis in many, or decriminalization, right, is probably the correct term in many places. Then we don't really know the impact of the levels of intake that are currently possible, honestly. And so there are some old studies. There was an interesting study that looked at Swedish conscripts in the army, and so like they have a ton of data on them, and they have a healthcare system that collects all like individuals' data, and they see differences in like psychiatric conditions based on marijuana use and that kind of stuff. So I think we have an inkling that it's probably not good, but the amount consumed back then versus now, I mean, it's orders of magnitude of like tens or hundreds or thousands of times more is possible to consume. And so I I don't do this research myself, but I have colleagues who do research in terms of, and so this is in terms of the developing brain, so like pregnant mothers who are using cannabis products. And some of the, like, it's not typical, but there are some studies where, like, and some individuals who are taking hundreds of milligrams of THC a day. Like, that's, like, if like a typical dose, right, you have an edible or something is 2 or 3 milligrams, and you're taking 100 times more
That's
than
a
that.
lot
Like,
of brownies.
it's it's a lot of brownies. So like,
Yeah.
and we have no idea what the implications of that are, because this is only a very recent development. But what's maybe interesting from a neuroscience perspective for me is that people often use these compounds, these products, and because they think it like improves some aspects of their function, like their creativity, right? That'd be a typical one for THC. But when you do studies in individuals, you give them THC and then you give them tasks where you can score how creative they're being, they feel more creative, but actually they're less creative.
I knew you were going to say that. Like, oh my gosh, it's a masterpiece. Look at my painting. That's pretty crappy. Okay, thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these products, and it's the same for like some of the stimulants that there are stimulants that we use in ADHD, modafinil, methylphenidate, right? These sort of amphetamine-based stimulants. People take them because they think it improves their focus, improves their productivity, right? People who don't need them, right? They have a different effect in the brains of people who have certain types of ADHD. If you're taking it for like a productivity or kind of hack, again, what you see, and it's actually, you can see the same thing with higher doses of caffeine. People feel better and they have faster reactions. So you improve their mood, but actually when you quantify or like you measure how they're performing in complex cognitive tasks, they're performing worse. So you create again this disconnect between, hey, I feel great, I must be doing better, but actually you're doing worse. And so I think it's just interesting from like a bigger perspective. A lot of these psychoactive compounds are creating this disconnect between how we feel and how we perform. Usually, when we're not under the influence of these things, and I'm including like high doses of caffeine here, and I say that as a coffee lover, when we're not under the influence of those things, we can actually become quite good at how we feel, being a judge of how we're performing, right? In athletes, subjective well-being is one of the best predictors of performance, right? But when we start to take some of these compounds, we uncouple those things. So we think we're doing better, but actually we're doing worse. And we could apply that to a large number of different compounds that you might choose to put in your body.
Yeah, maybe that's why alcohol gives you, more confidence in social setting, because you think more highly of your social skills all of a sudden.
I'm so interesting and charming right now, but actually
let me go bust in on that conversation and call the center of attention to myself. Oh, mercy.
You're just overbearing and drooling, and you think that you're super charming. Yeah.
Where's everyone going? Yeah. Tommy, this has been amazing, so helpful. The stimulated mind. Before we go, in honor of, I'm thinking of some of my buddies in particular who are very busy and they're interested in health and delaying aging and all that, but they don't have the time to get in deep. So if you were on an elevator with somebody and you only had a minute to give them a couple quick, really positive, high impact interventions, what things would you pick for the average person that's doing a decent job trying to be healthy and nutritious and restful, but what are the big areas that you might see
in that sort of currently working adult picture that we talked about earlier, right? I think one of the most impactful things that we can do is properly structure our workday, right? Give us, like, there's a period of time every day when we feel our best. Sometimes that's in the morning, sometimes it's in the afternoon, depending on who we are, right? Block that time off for focused work, whatever it is. And it could be 30 to 90 minutes. Whatever it is, what's the one thing you need to get done today, right? What's the creative, problem-solving, critical thinking task you need to do? What's the writing task you need to do? Block that out, right? Email goes away, phone goes away, notifications go away. That then anchors your day because you will feel good about the fact that you actually got the work done. And if you begin with not being able to pay attention or like focus because you're so scattered usually, we know that spending time focusing on a task, you can build your focus muscle. You get better at focus, right? So start there. Then build in breaks, just like 5 minutes of walk outside. Could be watching funny dog videos on Instagram, something that completely disconnects you from work, like nature, mindfulness. Like these are very restorative very quickly. Then kind of lump together your multitasking, task switching, meetings, emails, kind of stuff in one place, right? You need to get it done. Of course we do. But if we spread that throughout the day, for a lot of people, it means that we never actually get any work done. If we don't get work done, then our work slips over into the evening. It makes us stress. It impacts our sleep, right? We don't get time to exercise or focus on these other areas. So for them, I think building structure into our day and like having a very defined way we approach email, approach meetings, can actually do the work we need to do. That's where I'd start with them. Then for like the other group, like as we get older, then it's like the one thing that you can do is like pick one hobby that you want to get better at and do it. Learn a musical instrument, learn a language, learn how to play pickleball, right? That process, do that 2 or 3 times a week. That's going to maintain like all those important functions in the brain. So those are like the two broad, like, here's my pitch of what you need to do to get the maximum benefit, depending on the person standing in front of me.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. The Stimulated Mind. Where can we buy it? Everywhere books are sold, I'm sure. And how else can we connect with you?
Yeah, the book is available everywhere books are sold. It comes out on March 24th. There'll be an audiobook that I'm currently recording. If you buy it before then, which I'd be very appreciative of, then there's some pre-order goodies. I've got at home workout videos. I've got some recipes. You can get a chapter of the book early. All of this. So like you go to my website, drtommywood.com or thestimulatedmind.com. They'll take you and give you those details. And then Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood. All of my podcasts and all those other kind of things are posted there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time. Wonderful project. Dr. Tommy Wood, The Stimulated Mind. Thanks for listening, watching, and everybody.
Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed this video and will hit like and subscribe below. You can visit bradkearns.com for show notes, timestamps, and helpful links. Comment on the video. We read them all. You can also email us, podcast@bradventures.com. I love to connect. And the best way to support this channel is to check out the finest quality performance nutrition supplements in the world at bradnutrition.com or at the BRAD store on Amazon.